Welcome to the Ottawa International Writers Festival. Our 2020 virtual season is broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Ottawa International Writers Festival. My name is Chang-Richardson and I'm really excited that you're joining us here today. I am a poet, writer, and editor of Taiwanese and Cambodian Chinese descent. I have two chapbooks, one that came out with Anne Struther Press in January of this year and another forthcoming in the fall. If you want to find out more about me, you can visit my website at www.ehjchang.com or follow me on Twitter at ehjchang. So today, I am very excited to be joined here by Billy-Ray Belcourt. Billy-Ray honestly needs no introduction. If you don't know him, Google him, okay? Billy-Ray is the youngest ever winner of the Griffin Poetry Prize for his debut collection, The Wound is a World. We're here to chill and chat about his debut memoir, A History of My Brief Body, which is literally so hot off the presses that it's not here in front of me. So before we begin, I do want to do a brief land acknowledgement. We, the Ottawa International Writers Festival, are streaming to you from the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe First Nation, and Billy is streaming in from Vancouver, or more accurately, the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam nations. Before we begin, I actually would love Billy to read an excerpt from his memoir. So let's jump into that. Sit back and enjoy.
Okay. Thank you, and welcome, everybody. Here is the book, and I will read from an essay called Fragments from My Half-Existence. Cultural theorist Xian Nai defines diplomacy as an experience of boredom that is overwhelming, excessive, against calm. Sometimes I'm so bored with my puny life that it feels as though the roof above me is going to cave in. When not distracted by the noise of the social, life looms over me like a single rain cloud. Perhaps my next book will be about the fury that Indians sublimate to go about being in a world we didn't want, a line of inquiry that repeats in almost all my writing. My book would be a speech act unto itself in that I would unleash that fury onto the page. It wouldn't, however, help people live better. And because of this, it would be a failed text. Han Kang wrote a book called The White Book, translated from the Korean by Deborah Smith, that likely does help people live better. She's unflinching in her exploration of what it is to grow up inside a story of grief, of what it is to live in a place without boundedness where old memories materialize en masse. In a section called Lace Curtain, she meditates on what a freshly laundered bed linen can come to connote. And I quote, "You are a noble person, your sleep is clean, and the fact of your living is nothing to be ashamed of." Although it's beautifully rendered, I would want to turn this observation inside out, for I'm prone to spoiling even well-nourished words. The governing thesis of my book would be that we aren't noble people, and therefore the fact of our living is something to be ashamed of. The question I'd ask, what might it look like for Indians to refuse life in the wake of all that's happened to us in a country in which we're social experiments before all else? If I tried to compose anything but sad poems, I fear it'll be akin to a widower trying to convince others that he's found happiness again by wearing a t-shirt that says happiness. Why poetry? It allows for a romance of the negative that doesn't foreclose the possibility of a non-cruel kind of optimism. The political climate in which art is made will determine whether poetry is a unit of accusation or revelation. I'm writing a literature of blame, for the record. To my mind, one of the most vital modalities of decolonial life is that of remaining unaddressable to a settler public that feasts on our misery. Most of the time, writing a book seems incompatible with this. At the book launch of This Wound is a World, A white woman begged me not to kill myself. What this meant is that I hadn't yet died in a bewildering way. Then and now, I was and am a statistical and sociological feat. What she saw where my body should have been was an outline of a body crowded with indicators of my expiration date. She heard the terrible music, not of a desire for another world, but of a premature death, a mingling. I should have asked her to lament herself, her Canadian-looking practice. On a full midday flight from Toronto to Edmonton, white lady leans into me. Is Edmonton home? Me, restrained. Yes. Did you have a nice time in Toronto? Pulls headphone out of right ear. I was in Ottawa, actually, just connecting. Oh, what were you doing in Ottawa? I was at a literary festival. I'm a writer. Do you have a book? What is it called? This Wound is a World. Her eyes widen. Oh, This Wound is a World. What's it about? It's, I'm indigenous. It has a lot to do with colonialism. I teach therapists at the University of blank. And recently, a number of elders helped me really rethink how trauma affects indigenous peoples. Trauma isn't something you acquire. In my head, I think, you as in me specifically, trauma is literally who you are. An announcement by a flight attendant takes her attention elsewhere. Later, over Winnipeg, she asks if she can purchase food for me. Encounters of this sort are like a leg stuck out in front of you. You self-interrogate, are made to suspend yourself in an existential limbo. There is the material you in the airplane who is called into an openness you have no power over. Then the abstract you, the white woman conjures from a bank of public ideas that are injurious. What's more, a third you exists, the lyric you, he who observes, keeps watch, analyzes from afar, takes in data, then writes from a distance. In the end, all that matters is that all of you are bruised. The Endian condition, being in but not held by the present, belonging to a past that endures and a future that moves backwards. The problem is that the present is in the air, is now, which is always an empty hand opening and closing inside us like a heartbeat. Nothing else. A sustained loneliness thrusts one into a moral position. To be emptiness animated or personified is to be a true warning sign. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy. Reading A History of My Brief Body was an absolute intellectual delight for me, genuinely. I know on Twitter you mentioned not too long ago that some people have been calling it raw, simple. I completely disagree. I think everything within your words are loaded and just, it's like you mentioned in that first excerpt, it's a record of reality, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to actually bring up two of my favorite lines that are from this whole list of favorite lines, but I'm only going to highlight two. The first one is that so much of being alive in the Americas is about playing dead. Page 56 for anyone that's interested. And the second one is, there are killing fields where understanding blooms. Sometimes knowledge is a rope made of poison ivy. Why does anyone think it is more rope we need? And that's from page 109 in the subsection Terror. I want to actually talk about that real quick. I can see in this memoir that it's a distinct extension of your poetry practice. And in 2018, you mentioned the concept of a long poem. And I wonder if you can talk about how A History of My Brief Body weaves in and out of that poetic form.
Yeah. So when I began writing what then was just a loose archipelago of essays, hadn't yet become a book, I was grappling with my inability to write in any particular genre or mode. So I was writing poems, I was writing essays, I was writing essay-like poems and poem-like essays, and nothing really, congealed into anything that felt, conventionally publishable that look like, literature. But then I was also reading the work of writers like Anne Boyer and Fred Moten, for whom literature is not simply what's on the page, but what, values one marshals, or, what kind of feeling or emotion or political, fervor one can marshal in the, using the space of the page.
Yeah.
And, my poetic practice since This Wound is a World has largely been interested in not just exposing the ongoing brutalities of colonization, particularly in Canada, but also to begin to imagine what other worlds might look and feel like, or, simply to keep singing this, rebellious song that says, the present isn't all there is, and, that this world being one that we were, made to inherit by effect of colonization as Native people, that, we have been and can continue to build alternative structures of feeling, alternative modes of relating and caring for one another. So in a sense, my poetic practice, if I were to try to, reduce it to a sentence, has to do with, a politics of utopia that is actually a politics of care in a feminist sense, in a decolonial sense, in a queer sense.
Mm-hmm. We're going to come back to that idea of utopia. We're going to get there. But I love that. I can feel those theories bursting from the page. Mm-hmm. It's particularly, Indian identity or indigenous mm-hmm. identity, I should say, but I'm using your term here, Indian identity, mm-hmm. and society's systemically racialized constraints to indigenous livability. Mm-hmm. And, I love what you've done in the memoir of really just putting it out there. Can I ask what you ask yourself in your own memoir? What might it look like for Indians to refuse life in the wake of all that's been inflicted to you by this country?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that because, in that passage, I'm, I think asking both, Indigenous readers and non-Indigenous audience to think about what has been done to us as Native people, and also how we can continue to refuse that violence. And when I was writing that particular essay, I was trying to write what I saw at the time as a kind of fictional project about, or in response to, all the kinds of egregious juridical violence that were happening in the years 2018 and 2019, thinking specifically of, the notorious court cases of Gerald Stanley and Raymond Cormier on the prairies, the deaths of Indigenous teens, and the subsequent legal oppression that their cases saw, where no kind of justice was mm-hmm. realized. And so I was thinking, in the face of this country's refusal to allow for a kind of historical reckoning or historical justice, or contemporary justice for that matter, what would it look like if Indigenous peoples enacted a similar kind of refusal? What if we refused Canada as the sign under which we gather and make life and relate to one another? How do we enact our own kinds of sovereignty despite, the Indian Act and the Constitution looming over us as these sort of legal umbrellas? So that's to say I don't have an answer, but also the answer is that we've already been doing it. We've already, mm-hmm. As Native people, been using what we've inherited, for example, the form of the reserve, the space of the reserve, as a place to not succumb to the norms, the racial norms, racializing norms that seek to further extend our suffering. So,
can you just repeat that last bit of that last sentence?
Totally.
Cut out
so the bit of the
Using the Indian
yeah,
reservations as a place, as a space.
Right. So the reserve, for example, being in this place where we relate to other in ways that don't reproduce these norms, these racializing norms that seek to extend our suffering.
Mm-hmm. And I can see that being embodied and really brought forth, not just within one Indigenous person, but also in your entire community as a whole, of love, and what you talk about, moving forward with love at the root of all of your action, and working towards that sort of utopia as a rallying call. How do you think that we as a society, and the listeners that are non-Indigenous, that Can Lit as an institution, how Canada as an institution can work towards also embracing and embodying that call? It's something I've been grappling with myself, and
Right.
trying to figure out.
Totally. Yeah, I think this question can be approached in a few ways, one of which is a practical one. So, this is the usual instruction manual for, being a good ally. So, which simply boils down to, don't further perpetuate either nor actions that contribute to Indigenous people's suffering. So,
which everyone, if you're listening, obviously, but don't let Billy-Ray Belcourt or any Indigenous writer or any writer of color do this work for you. There are so many resources online. There's incredible Google Docs and just lists upon lists of how you can help decolonialize your own mind. So let's do that.
Totally.
Let's do that.
Yes, thank you. And there's an institutional manner with which this can be done. So the redistributing of resources to Indigenous people, Indigenous communities. I see the university as being a place where this can happen. Also, the publishing world is the place where this can happen. I think that we should see more Indigenous editors, more Indigenous people employed by publishing houses of all kinds, indie to the major corporate ones. I think that will be one way that we as a nation continue to change the story of what Indigenous life looks and feels like. I also think, from a philosophical point of view, that there needs to be this refusal of what, I have called, a la Dion Brand and Christina Sharp, these grammars of deficiency and depravity that don't allow our notions of indigeneity to signify futurity and livability and flourishing. So how do we, shed these decades old, these centuries old ideas of indigeneity that first and foremost center our capacity for joy and love? And that's one of the central arguments of the memoir that I try to make in the memoir, which is, how do we tell our story, an individual one and a collective one, without, again, allowing others to feast on our misery, as I say in that excerpt, but instead to be moved by our ongoing and long-standing desire to be free of the violence that has been to us, and also to build alternative worlds that, are not only for the betterment of Native people, but, for all the people on these lands, on, the Indigenous lands of North America. Because, I think also something that Fred Moten has written, which is, I think has become notorious, and I'm not going to, I'm going to paraphrase so I don't swear, but he says, I don't need your help. So he's a Black theorist and poet working out of the US. And he says, I don't need your help. He's like, I need you to realize that this shit is killing you, however softly. the shit that's killing us, or that's, in his us is black people, is also killing y'all, and the y'all is white people, just slowly. So how, and I find that an important corrective to these ways of thinking that somehow ending racism or other forms of oppression mean that life is less livable for others who have been the beneficiaries of these structures of oppression for a long time. No, that's we're not thinking about material gain. We're thinking about a profound philosophical shift that means that we can all do more for one another.
I think that's a bigger conversation that I would love to sit down and have with you, because I completely agree. I think you can see it in anti-racism against Asian individuals, especially in the face of COVID-19. You can see it interwoven into racism against Black folks in Black Lives Matters, and that's interwoven, especially in Canada, into indigenous populations and communities as well. And it is about shifting the thought process behind it all and making that paradigm shift to, if you help me, this will help you too. What is that age-old phrase? Help me, help you.
Right. I also think of something Claudia Rankine notes in the introduction to her play, The White Card, where she says, as I, travel the country, the U.S., and I do Q&As sometimes, and she was the example of a white man in the audience asking her what he could do for her. And I get this question too. And a lot of racialized writers get this question, queer trans writers. And she says, the question shouldn't be, what can you do for me, but what can you do for yourself? Yeah. And when I read that, I was like, that is absolutely, that is absolutely the question that needs to be asked.
Yes, 100%. I want to talk about how your memoir actually is a beautiful collection of, it is sort of like a beautiful collection of long essays that are also poetic in form. And there's a gorgeous, the alphabet section is my absolute favorite. It reminded me of your erasure piece for some reason in Indian coping mechanisms. And it's, it actually, for all of those who are interested in picking up Billy-Ray's book, please do. This is an incredible, just digest it. I devoured it in 3 days. So if I can devour it in 3 days, you can too. It's and I think, if you're trying to grapple with what we're talking about right now, that idea of utopia and moving forward with love and creating sort of a different reality based off of the idea of community and love and being there with each other, it actually puts into mind another anthology that I recently read, which is edited by Alicia Elliott, and it's 150 Years of Resistance, I believe is the title. And it's a graphic novel, and it was put out at Canada 150, and it's an incredibly beautifully done anthology of Indigenous writers that really touches and sort of not just touches on, but really embodies what Billy and I are talking about right now, which is that sort of moving forward with love and trying to philosophically at the root of our thinking change on a base level, which is incredibly difficult after I don't know how many years of colonial systemic oppression.
Right.
And actually, speaking about that, I wanted to quote another line out of Billy's book, which is, "Hope is the settler state not equating to the world. The right is to live on." And that's kind of, those are two separate phrases for anyone who's wondering. I smushed them together because I think that's beautiful, that sentiment. And I want to ask you, Billy, what's next for you in your writing? To write is to live on. What's next for your writing?
Yeah. So, as I was writing this book and then editing it, I was also, as I, mentioned earlier, trying to write a novel. And so I've been working on something under the name of a novel about Northern Alberta. And so in, my attempts to write a novel, I kept coming up again and again to an obstacle that had to do with subject. I have a great sense of what my subject matter was, and especially as at the time a 24-year-old, wondering what I could possibly say across the span of a novel that wouldn't be, superficial or trite. And I finally ended up back in northern Alberta, and I thought so little has been written about this place, and further, even less by Native people, by queer Native people. And I thought, what could I say that could get at, or what I see as a larger phenomenon, but that I have come to know because of my upbringing in northern Alberta, which is the way that people are empowered by history to see themselves as being outside of history. So we don't see ourselves if we aren't given opportunities for consciousness raising or becoming familiar with the critical apparatus. We aren't allowed to see ourselves as being political subjects. So I wanted to figure out what that means in everyday life, less as a theoretical thing and more as a material lived reality. And that's been coming together. I've been thinking of it as like a chorus. There's a number of voices from a number of experiences, have to do with race, gender, class, sexual orientation. And I've also been thinking, more about poems. I haven't been writing a whole lot of poems, but I still think about them all the time. I'm teaching 2 advanced poetry workshops in the fall at UBC, and so I'm always thinking about poetry.
Yes, congratulations.
And I would like, to write. Oh yeah, thank you.
Congratulations on seeing that. So I actually had a question about the long poem that we glazed over because we got really into our awesome the rest of the conversation. But did you ever write that one long poem about performance art, the white gaze, hyperbole, and grief? Or is this? Or is this it?
I don't know if I ended up writing that long poem. I think often I will write something and it'll fall apart and I'll put it elsewhere. And that's actually how a lot of this book was written, sort of what fell away from other writing, other piecing. And that catalog, I think, is a kind of long poem. And again, it's full of fragments from other projects that didn't end up being published or that didn't end up making it into a final draft, or I just didn't think that they fit in the scope of whatever I was writing at the time. And these are just sort of like ruminations on keywords that I use and that I see being used often in the discourse, but also, in decolonial writing and Native writing more generally. So, I mean, yeah.
I actually made some little notes. So I studied art history and its related concepts and philosophies. And to me, I see, performance art. Let's break that down. Performance art. Honestly, you're living, being in your body on every day. White gaze is everywhere. It's systemic. Hyperbole is what the white gaze sees your existence to be. And Indian grief is reality that's woven into your skin. And I honestly, those 4 things, to me, weave underneath and through the entirety of a history of my brief body. And I really love that about this memoir. So everyone listening, go and pick it up, okay? Now, one extra little question for the art lovers out there. I want to talk about the cover art of your book.
Yeah.
It's a collage titled Of Another Natural History, #1, and it's by Niagara-based artist Maggie Grote. She mentions that it's a work that's interested in recentering things that lie on the margins of it. And I know it's titled One, so it's part of a larger series of work. And let's talk about the choice of that specific piece for a history of my brief body.
It'll be helpful to see that. That lovely mushroom in the corner there is my favorite.
Love it.
So my editor, David Ross, actually emailed me last summer and was like, "Hey, Billy-Ray, I know it's super early, but I think I found the cover for your book is, and I saw it, and I was like, this is absolutely the cover of my book. And I think it's because the collage-like nature of the book really resonated with the form the memoir takes, which is collage-like, and there's a lot of fragments and juxtaposition and things put together that, sometimes don't, narratively make sense or don't make sense in a chronological way, but I think gain momentum or meaning by being beside each other nonetheless. And I see that, mirrored in the art. I also use a lot of natural metaphors, and so that made sense, that felt compatible. And even on the spine, the mushroom appears. So
oh my God, I love that. See, I was reading, okay, so I had to read off a PDF of your book, and I didn't get to see that little detail. I love that. Totally. Can we see it again? Let's see it again.
So, shout out to the graphic design team in Canada.
Yeah, that's
and there's
beautiful.
The lovely back quote, very dramatic.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a beautiful. You might not even want to read it. You just might want to buy it because it's an object, and I endorse that.
Yeah, set it on a pedestal, people, so you can walk around it like a sculptural object. Okay.
It's what we deserve.
Exactly. Exactly. I totally forgot what I was going to ask. I was going to ask one last thing, but now it's completely slipped my mind. So actually, no, I remember. One last thing. I know I said we were talking one last thing, but it's not one last thing ever. One more last thing is I want you to talk about the realities of the queer indigenous life, because that's another thing that really weaves itself in throughout your memoir, and that's something that sets your memoir apart from other memoirs that I've read up to this point. And
totally.
Yeah. Go.
Yeah. So this is again a central thread in the memoir, and it begins in my childhood when the experience of being closeted sort of structures my ideas of what the future could look like, and essentially set in motion much of what would follow into adulthood in terms of my understandings of intimacy and love, and what I could expect or not from other partners. And there's the middle section of the book really attends to my early experiences in the dating world as a 19-year-old and 21-year-old, and not having any kind of blueprint for how to be in the world of love without losing parts of myself. And that was a difficult thing to endure. And so towards the end of the book, I begin, I think, to elaborate another theory of love, which goes back to my, what I learned from my kokum, or what I saw practiced by my kokum, her theory of love being also a theory of freedom. So, love needs, I think, in order to be capacious and sustainable, needs to also make us free from, terror, violence, all these kinds of things. And being queer and being indigenous, you live out a particular historical and political conjecture, and one cannot fully understand one of those things without the other, becomes a very particular shade of experience. And I think it's important, that alongside other writers like Joshua Whitehead and other trans indigenous writers like Jay Simpson and Ariel Twist, that we see, the particularity of that story. And, our stories aren't, the whole story, but I think that they're important at the very least.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry, I cut you off. They're important at the very least.
Totally. I'm excited to see that literature grow. And I think that for so long, the story of indigenous life in this country was single focus, which, meaning it had only to do with race. And now we're talking about race and gender and sexuality, and race and gender and sexuality and class. And so we have this really robust, multidimensional lens being used by writers in this country. And I think, that will only allow us to have a more, inclusive and robust politics and vision of care and resistance.
I think that's super important. I mean, there's so many youth that struggle not just with systemic race and trying to figure themselves out within that reality, but also with the dysphoria of not being within the body that is prescribed by that same society.
Totally.
And there's a beautiful quote on page 140 that I would love for you to read to everyone if you can.
Sure.
It starts with Indian youth listen.
Right.
And I want to finish our interview on that because I think it really embodies the utopia that you talk about, and also will give younger readers and listeners hopefully something to latch onto.
Totally. Indian youth, listen. To be lost isn't to be unhinged from the possibility of a good life. There are doorways everywhere, ones without locks, doors that swing open. There isn't only now and here, elsewhere and somewhere too. Speak against the coloniality of the world, against the rote of despair it causes, in an always loudening chant. Please keep loving.
Thank you, Billy-Ray.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you for joining me today, and thank you everyone for tuning in and listening, and please listen and please keep loving.